live with that and say, if that's what democracy comes out with, that's what we have to live with. So, just to bring some conclusions. One, I think we've got lots and lots of mechanisms whereby slippery slopes have been suggested could work. I don't find them very persuasive. We have pragmatic arguments, we have self-interested arguments. I'm not sure either of those are really terribly persuasive. And I think the notion that it might change our attitudes, we could see as being not an argument against change from slippery slopes, but even the fact that maybe it will teach us more. As a result, our views will change. And I think our views changing and progressing and developing in the light of experience arguably is one of the things we should be aspiring to, not one of the things we should be avoiding. So, a couple of things. One, to be fair, this is a talk about slippery slopes. It's not a talk about euthanasia, although that's my main interest and that's why I've been emphasising it. People may wish to make a strong case against euthanasia without slippery slopes. And in some people's terms, such cases can be made, and that's fine with me. What I would argue is that the slippery slope argument doesn't actually add anything. It's fundamentally flawed. We can't determine whether it occurs. We can't predict in what direction it's going to occur. So basically, if we're going to come to any kind of conclusions about any of these topics, including euthanasia, think about them in terms of other factors. Don't be influenced by slippery slope arguments. And at that point, I suspect it's probably a good idea to shut up, but I will happily answer any questions or take comments and useful suggestions from people. Thank you.
Yeah, the case for voluntary euthanasia is quite straightforward. There's nothing ambiguous about it. What you've got to do, you've got to make your wishes known while you've still got your marbles in writing before a witness. If you don't qualify for a voluntary euthanasia. So therefore the slippery slope is irrelevant.
Yeah, I mean, I don't wish to be devil's advocate here because I have no real objection to this. But to be fair to those who would argue a case against, there is a level which says something like, are my views now the same as they were when I was 20 or when they were 30? Now, if they're not the same now when I was 20 or 30, who is to say that my views when I have dementia or whatever are the same as they were when I was fully compos mentis? Now, I don't feel terribly strongly about this, but I can accept that someone might see that as being a limitation of a living will. Personally, from a pragmatic point of view, I'm entirely with you, because I think if we're looking for a solution to any of these problems, which will be completely snag-free, then we're chasing a holy grail. And I think sometimes we have to accept, well, okay, that could happen, but equally, it could equally happen you're even more in favour of euthanasia when you reach that point. We don't know either way. So since we don't know, that shouldn't influence our decision-making. It's what the decision analysts call the sure thing principle. If there is a course of action which is just the same whichever way option you go for, it shouldn't affect the preference. But in fairness to the opponents, I feel I should at least mention the point of view.
Sorry.
There's a variation perhaps on the self-interested argument you're talking about, where people talk about that they begin their slippery slope argument, but of course it's on premises that they alone have set and haven't gone about justifying or even articulating in any very great depth. Does that fit into the self-interested argument on it?
A little bit, but I mean, this is a bit like when I get people from Islam and Catholicism telling me that it's just wrong. And there comes a point there where I have to say, well, I know that really there is absolutely nothing I can say to you that would change your view on this. I know that the premises you're working from, which is that God tells you this is wrong and therefore it is wrong, are never going to make any sense to me. So maybe we're just wasting our time if we discuss it. Let's just go and have a beer instead. Well, I don't say let's go and have a beer to the people who are Muslim. It tends to be a bad thing to say. But yeah, let's go and do something else and talk about something else. I think there are some people whose, as you said, fundamental assumptions are either implicit or not particularly rational, that just mean the thing will never shift.
Now, what about this, another one where they present a slippery slope argument and the first part of it seems quite reasonable, but then they are inferring a whole slippery slope from a first step, which is on the face of it quite logical. This is what you see Christian conservatives doing quite often. They will say, if, then, and that first then is plausible enough, but it's the second then that is thoroughly fear-mongering.
Yeah, this can be really quite cleverly done. I remember one very pretty example during some euthanasia discussions where someone stood up and quoted these very precise figures, and they were wonderfully precise and convincing. It wasn't around 2,000, around 3,000. It was 2,761, which sounds like you've done your research. Really good. And next sentence was, and people are now walking the streets in fear in Holland. And because the first bit sounded very convincing, scientific, logically based, the second one got this spurious credibility with it, because the second one is purely no evidence whatever for it, no evidence even presented for it, but simply suggested as, yes, that goes with it. And of course, it's a cunning move, it's a clever debating tactic, but I think anyone with a reasonable amount of experience of these kind of debates soon sees through that and learns to tease apart the premise and the non sequitur conclusion. I hope so. Sorry,
yeah, the thing that comes to mind when I think about slippery slopes is that the only ones that I can think of in history that are glaringly obvious are ones that have happened in totalitarian societies, where the people going down that slippery slope have so much control that there's no consequences for them taking the next step and the next step and the next step. So that, be it, concentration camps or surveillance of the society, or all those places where there's been real slippery slopes.
Absolutely, and yeah, those of you who've heard me talk about ethics stuff before will know that one of my main premises is that abuses of any kind of system occur when you have one group with control over another, but there is no control in the opposite direction. And this has been demonstrated experimentally quite elegantly in a number of contexts. I suppose the most famous is Philip Zimbardo's simulated prison experiment, where he simply divided people at random into playing the parts of prisoners or guards and had them acting as if they were in prison. And within a matter of days was getting terribly abusive behaviour from the people who'd been appointed as guards and terribly submissive behaviour from the people who were appointed as prisoners. And the clear evidence there is it's not some people are intrinsically nasty and the rest of us are nice, but rather that the circumstances produce the behaviour. And I think that certainly is a message for if we are legislating on anything, we need to make sure that control occurs in both directions. And of course, in the voluntary euthanasia context, that's pretty much a non-issue, because every piece of legislation I've seen around the world, in Switzerland, in Holland, in various other countries where euthanasia has been permitted, in Oregon, there are clear restrictions in terms of the person having to make a request, having to be an enduring request, and they're having to show that they're competent to make it. And that seems to be a clear counter-control that the law will back the person who says, no, I don't want euthanasia. And as long as we have that in, the slippery slope concerns you talk about really don't arise.
Do you think that circumstances will force the state to adopt voluntary euthanasia in future because it's simply too costly to keep sick people alive?
I like to hope it wouldn't be for that reason. I think what will happen is that with an increasingly secular society, some of the current constraints on things like euthanasia will become weaker, because the notion that some vague superstition tells you it's wrong and therefore you must follow it will no longer be one of the things holding legislation back. I'm not entirely sure that the cost issue is going to be a particularly important one. It may vary according to different societies. We have much concern in New Zealand, for example. People will tell us we have an increasingly ageing society. What we actually have is a decreasingly young society, and I make that distinction advisedly. It's not that people are necessarily living that much longer, it's just they're having fewer children. And so we don't have that pyramid that used to occur in the days when everybody had 4, 5, 6 children. There were always a lot of young people who could share the cost of supporting those who might be older, infirm, whatever, who couldn't support themselves for one reason or another. I like